Good afternoon to everyone. This is the second webinar on social impact bonds organized by AVPN. My name is Stacy and I am responsible for membership services at AVPN. A warm welcome to many of our members who are signed on today, and to those who are not familiar, AVPN is a membership-based organization headquartered in Singapore, working to promote venture philanthropy principles and methodologies in Asia. If you have further questions on AVPN, you can contact me after the webinar via email. Last week, Social Finance US shared their experience with social impact bonds with us, and today we are happy to welcome Mr. Ian Learmonth, Executive Director of Impact Investing with Social Ventures Australia, who will share with us their social benefit bonds and the lessons that they learned executing these in Australia. Before we proceed, a few housekeeping instructions. We will not take any questions during Ian's presentation, which will last about 20 minutes, as all questions will be taken after. During the webinar, please use the console to type in your questions, and I will collate them and raise the questions to Ian at the end of his presentation. If you have further questions that are not answered by the end of the webinar, you can email us. The webinar recording will be posted on our website within the week. I will now hand over the presentation to Ian. Ian?
Thanks, Stacey, and welcome everyone. And it's very pleased to be able to have the opportunity to talk to you about social impact bonds, or benefits bonds as they have been known in some ways in Australia today. Firstly, just very briefly, Social Ventures Australia is a non-profit organisation. About 55 or so people here, has been in existence for over 12 years and is active in the areas of venture philanthropy, particularly in education and employment. It provides strategic consulting advice to the non-profit and broader sectors across Australia, and is also, for the last 3 years, which is the area that I've been leading, active in impact investing. So that's, as many of you know, investing capital for both a financial and a social return. So blending the financial and the social. And, we've done a number of things, including, we bought the ABC Learning Centres here in Australia, which was a very large early learning centre, national early learning centres business. Over $165 million, using some social capital for the equity. We have a social impact fund which we set up with the Commonwealth Government, and we have completed one social benefit bond, or impact bond, and we've just about completed a second one, which I will touch on, although we're still arguing with the government about whether or not they're going to allow us to proceed with it. And we are in active conversations with many governments right around the country on, the next social impact bonds in the Australian marketplace. So that's just a bit of background on SVA, and very briefly on me. I, was in the world of finance for many years before joining SVA 3 years ago. So I have a background in investment banking, both in Sydney. 5 years in Hong Kong, so I'm quite familiar with the Asian market in the mainstream financial world, and 10 years in London. So I guess I've had some experience in different locations. So social impact bonds we're going to talk about for 20 or so minutes today. What you need, I'm just scrolling through to the third slide, which I'm assuming everyone can see. And for a social impact bond, what do you need? Well, it's the thing about them, of course, and as you know from those who attended the Social Finance US presentation, it's very much a three-way collaboration between government, investors, and an underlying service provider. And unless you have all three in agreement and a deal that works for those three parties, then of course you're going to you're not going to be able to generate a social impact bond. So we're going to look at the issues for all three of those parties, and we'll also talk, or I will talk about the implementation of the Australian example of last year, the new PIN social benefit bond, a little bit maybe about the recidivism bond, and maybe more other observations about what's needed to progress the market. At the very highest of levels, and I guess I'm going back to basics here, it's all about taking private capital. As you can see, there's a group of people on the right-hand side of the slide contributing money into the bucket there. So private investors funding the bucket, which in turn enters into a long-term contract. In many cases, it's done in this way, that intervenes with a population to address a difficult social issue, and upon demonstration of the success of that program, which effectively is for a government, so the columns on the left-hand representing the government, and the arrow up to the left-hand side demonstrating the outcomes, then the government is paying out on what they see as the program reaching its sort of KPIs effectively. So a payment by outcomes contract, and then funds are returned to the private investors. And it's for the investors, it's all about getting an adequate return for the risks that they're taking, like all investments, combining it with the social outcomes that they see the money is achieving. For the service delivery provider, it's about entering into long-term contracts that allow it to plan, give it certainty of funding. It obviously puts some pressure on them to achieve certain outcomes, and depending on the way it's structured, they may or may not be rewarded or penalised for being either successful or unsuccessful. And for government, it's an opportunity to fund on a low risk, or in fact in some cases a sort of a very almost no risk basis, very often preventative programs addressing difficult social issues. So there are attractions for all three parties. At a very high level, for governments to be interested in entering into these structures, and there have been a dozen or more undertaken in the UK, a handful in the US. Australia has completed 3, hoping to do more. From the way we see the economics, we think that the government needs to have identified an expensive problem, and that problem in Australian dollar terms is probably somewhere around $100 million or more, because then we'll sort of show you why we think that is a threshold amount for the problem. If it's significantly less than the actual savings generated and shared around may make the program just a little inefficient or too small to be worth the structure in implementing the structure. It's often a problem that is much better dealt with through prevention, things like recidivism, homelessness, child protection, and so on. But governments are very often dealing with crisis expenditure, so they're addressing the people who've in some ways fallen off the cliff rather than dealing with them before they even get to that point. So it is attractive in the sense that it's maybe not funding that government has budget for today. Well, in Australia we've needed motivated politicians. The relevant ministers have to be keen. The government has to be also able to be the necessary data to be able to particularly to compare the performance of the program to a control group. And I think between all three parties, but particularly government, there needs to be some flexibility and pragmatism. We're talking about the $100 million problem, and I'm now onto the just looking at how that translates into the size of the bond and the savings. So if we say that the problem that a particular country, for example, in Asia might be, it might be repeat offending by a particular cohort. It might be the cost of a particular health issue, and that's $100 million. If we raise a bond for $10 million, the grey slice of the pie, we fund an underlying service provider to achieve the outcomes that we're looking for, and then they are able to reduce the problem, so the $100 million problem by 30%, then we've saved the government $30 million. If the government pays 20 of the 30 out, which will be returned to the investors, and assuming that the bond has a life of somewhere between 5 or 7 years, putting $10 million out the door today and getting $20 million, let's say, in 7 years' time, would give it a 10-12% return. So very simple economics, but then the government, by paying out $20 million, having saved 30, they get their net savings. So that's a very simplified example of the broad economics. So when we've been talking to state governments around the countryside, we've been trying to identify problems, social issues that have that scale of expense. Investors, what are their high-level needs? Well, in our market, I think we've, and some of the other participants have, and including government, have thought that it should be at least a bond size of 5 million or more. It would be great if it was 50 million, because then you get more interest from the institutional professional investment market rather than the high net worth trust endowment participants that we've seen to date in Australia. But a minimum of 5 is what we've been working off. Term is usually at least 4 or 5 years, often up to 10, because you're normally intervening with your target population for the first 4 or 5 years, and then you're starting to measure the success or otherwise of your intervention over the subsequent 4 or 5 years. So that's why the maturity is more like 10 years, up to 10 years. How much capital is at risk? In Australia, there's been some protection of the downside with the 2 bonds that have been raised to date. In the UK, the Peterborough bond, there was you could lose all your principal if it was unsuccessful. We haven't seen the hard results of that quite yet. Hopefully, we'll see those fairly soon. But if you don't have any protection and the risk of downside is 100%, and there's some difficult risks to quantify, you find that it's increasingly difficult once again to attract the more bigger pools of money, the professional investor market. You tend to find yourself more down at the philanthropic style investor who's prepared to potentially chance their capital with the prospect of it coming back. Financial returns have been somewhere between 8%, where certainly in a new PIN bond we're targeting 10% or a little more. So that they've been the sort of IRRs that we've been going for with the unprotected slice of the second of the out-of-home care bonds in Australia. You were able to get a return of up to 30%, but you could lose all your money on the downside. Social return, well, that's I guess that's a given in a sense, but we've found in Australia investors are very keen to understand exactly what the social outcomes are, making sure that they're not that they're visible, demonstrable, and they believe that you can achieve them. So I think there's it is as important in some ways as the financial returns. Just looking at what we've done, the new PIN benefit bond, I'm just scrolling through the structure. We raised $7 million from about 59 investors. They were consolidated through a unit trust, the New Pen Social Benefit Bond Trust, a little bit like a syndicated loan in this case. And instead of subcontracting Uniting Care to do the work with restoring children to out-of-home care, which is what the program is about, we on-lent it on terms that the principal and interest repayment depended upon the success of restoration by the program. So as families that had children taken off them and in the care of the state or foster parents, they would go to the Uniting Care program and seek out the possibility of having that young child under the age, as I say, of 5 being restored back with them. And the key metric on the interest and principal repayment to our investors was, do we get somewhere between 55 and 65% of those children returned to their parents? If they did, the investors will get a 10 to 12% return. Uniting Care, in turn, entered into the payment by outcomes contract with the New South Wales government. Even though the bond was quite small, the payment by outcomes contract was much greater, and they are hoping to restore over the 7.5-year period of the bond quite a significant number of children back with their families, which will generate savings to the state of something like $90 million, and the government is paying out approximately half of that, or a little bit more than that, $50 million, some of which will go back to repay the bond, others will fund the expansion of the program. Okay, so that's the basic structure. SVA, Social Ventures Australia, are the managers of the trust, reporting both the financial and social position of the program back to the investors on a semi-annual basis. Interest rate minimum 5% during the first 3 years of the 7.5-year term of the bond. Downside protection in the worst case scenario. You can see there at no point could an investor lose more than 50 cents in the dollar, and so there were a couple of early termination triggers. If things had been going very poorly, the restoration rate of children back with their parents through this holistic parenting program, if it's unsuccessful, then very unsuccessful, then there's an ability to terminate year 3. The second of the bonds that we've been working on is still to be signed off by the government, and we're there's still significant risk about whether they will proceed to do that. This is a social impact bond where we once again raising something like $7 million. It may be slightly less in the end. A little different in the sense that the trust that Social Ventures is establishing, we established to raise the money and collect the investor contributions or their subscriptions. We are entering into the payment by outcomes contract with the government, and the target there is to reduce the repeat offending rate by adult males coming out of 4 prisons in New South Wales. And the subcontract with Mission Australia is I think, as I described at the outset, that's the underlying service delivery. Mission Australia hires case workers, works at prisons, provides drug and alcohol rehab, training, jobs, social housing, introductions over the 6.5-year period of the bond. Well, the most active in the first 4.5 years, and then the measurement takes place, from year 3 onwards. So that we are still hopeful to get that out. The other thing I'd mention before I go on any further is there was the Benevolent Society here in Sydney completed a second one. So our one, the Uniting Care one, which I talked about, was the first. Benevolent Society did one. Theirs was a preventative program in the area of out-of-home care. So instead of the first one I talked about, where we were restoring children back with their families after they'd been taken away. The Benevolent Society worked with families who were at risk of having the young children taken into state care, and they were comparing how they performed against a control group, and they would be paid out on on agreed performance levels. With the service providers in these social benefit bonds, and I'm sure it's the same around the world, there are certain things that you need to for these things to make sense for an NGO or a charity. I noticed that quite a number of the audience are from that sector. There's obviously the desire to want to go through what can be a long and complex lead time in implementing these things. You have to want to be interested in expanding your services, being subject to the accountability. There's a lot of robust reporting and comparison of your outcomes against what is invariably a control group, either a dynamic or live counterfactual group, or or a more static historical figure that you're trying to beat. And I think you'd want to think that it was going to be a positive experience, because you do need to dedicate quite a lot of time and effort management and so on of your team to implement these things. The development capability we're going to talk about. Well, in the process of implementing these things, as mentioned, you need time, you need resources that are able to build things, like the financial model of mapping out the services that you might deliver, costs associated with that, what you think you can, what sort of results you think you can generate, and what savings they translate to your respective governments. Are you going to reduce the number of homeless people in a particular area? How much do those homeless people cost the government? How many people of the group that you're working with would probably come out of homelessness anyway, even without your intervention? You have to look at that. Are you going to use your existing services? Are you going to import new technology and service delivery ideas from another country, from another state? You're going to have your lawyers look at the structure which makes sense for you as well. There's quite a lot to think about. Measuring savings, I'm just sort of conscious of time. I won't dwell too long on it, but the key thing is to be able to identify and measure the effect and the savings that you're generating for the government, the relevant government. You've got to work out what's the current cost of this problem for the government. Are you what with confidence can the influence that you can have? Are you going to reduce repeat offending by 5%, 10%? Are you going to reduce the number of children in out-of-home care by a particular absolute number? What would be the counterfactual in your country? How could you ensure that it's you making the difference and not some other change of potentially government policy, which is for whatever reason reducing the number of people returning to prison anyway? So they're the sort of things that you need to think about in terms of the core issue of measuring savings. And one of the issues we've had in Australia, which is a country that has 3 tiers of government, and different governments have the responsibility for different expenses. When you're working out the cost of a problem, you need not only to look at, if you say take someone out of homelessness, or you improve the education outcomes of a disadvantaged child at a very young age, you might project out across the life of that individual, the next 20 or 30 years. You might look at the various improvements and savings to the community in terms of that person going into gainful employment, paying taxes, having less of a burden on the health system, and so on, potentially less of a strain on the justice system, but also be careful about, does that sit at a different tier of government? I think it's less of an issue in the Asian world than it is in places like Australia and the US. And is it cutting across different departments in government? Do you need to get a number of ministers together to look at that sort of thing? I've just kind of got there on the slide there our new PIN out-of-home care bond, which I talked about, and the Empower Recidivism bond. There's some of the cost savings that we work with, some of the key assumptions. Take a child in Australia, in New South Wales, in foster care, costs about 37,000 Australian dollars a year. If you take a young child out of that, return them with their family, the government were able to be comfortable that statistically translated to 9 years savings. So, 9 years of $37,000 present valued. That was your saving pool per successful restoration. In the world of recidivism or avoiding repeat offending, governments look at how many potentially, how many nights in prison that a particular avoided reconviction might translate to statistically. What is the cost of a night in prison? Often it's difficult, if you only reduce a small number of prisoners relative to a very large prison, you can't close down a wing, you can't reduce the number of people working at that particular facility, and therefore sometimes the savings can get more marginal. So that's just something to think about. Proxy measures, we've been looking at in the recidivism bond. Our measure was the number of people returned to prison during the 2 years post-release, and with new PIN, our measure for the saving was whether a child was successfully returned to their family. That was the test. Counterfactual or control group. You've got all sorts of different things that you can use. It's often one of the great challenges is getting something that is a fair comparison. You can, at the most simple, a government might say to you, our historic reconviction rate is 75% for this particular group, and if you can beat that by X%, then we'll, each year if you beat it by an agreed percent, then we'll pay out on some formula. That's what I guess we'd call a sort of a fixed or historical counterfactual, and then you can get increasingly more sophisticated. In the area of repeat offending, as we did here at Look To in New South Wales, we were creating a like-for-like control group. We were getting based on age, risk profile, whether they were an Indigenous Australian or not, and to try and get almost a mirror group and see how they perform. It's one of the great challenges is seeking out and identifying the suitable counterfactual. It's very important for the government, of course, because they want to make sure they're paying out on a real saving and not a perceived one. There were some examples that I touched on. Once again, the new PIN and the Empower Recidivism one. For the first 3 years in the out-of-home care, whilst we built up a live control group, we had a fixed counterfactual, 25%, and we have a live one with our recidivism bond. That's just the next slide really just talks about how many people were hoping to go through the program and the sort of statistical errors that you can get if your numbers are not sufficiently large. If people often say we've got a difficult issue with very precise group of people. In Australia, often people say we've got an issue with repeat offending amongst young Aboriginal people in a particular location, and could you implement a bond around that? The only trouble with that is you might only be intervening with 50 to 100 people. So you know, there's a lot of statistical error when you get down to those sorts of numbers. So you know, the greater the numbers you can work with, of course, the more real your outcomes will be, taking into account statistical error. We've talked a little bit about the delivery capability in the course of the development side, but once again, you know, you will be staffing up for to implement your program. You may need to go to new locations. You may need to, you know, in some cases in the homelessness world, you may need to build bricks and mortar. You might need to build housing. You'll have to implement additional reporting, particularly you know, for the investors, and to compare to the counterfactual, ultimately for your payments to be agreed with government. So, sort of apologies, I've run over time a little bit, but look, I hope that's a helpful overview of the sort of things that have been happening. I'll just maybe finish by saying that 3 states in Australia, South Australia, Queensland and Western Australia, are all at varying stages of looking to implement social impact bonds. Here, they're looking very closely at what's happened in New South Wales, where the first 2 have been established and are up and running. And you know, we're hopeful that more will be, you know, that more will be implemented here in Australia. So maybe I'll leave it there, Stacey, and see if people have got questions, and I'm very happy to take them.
Sure. Thank you very much, Ian. I think that was a lot of data for everyone to process too. But thank you very much. I have a couple of questions that came in during the webinar. And again, I would like to encourage everyone who have questions, please use the console and type in your questions under the part where it says questions. Yeah. So my first question comes from Philo, who's based in Hong Kong. He asked, how much of the key protection features were driven mainly by investors' demand?
Sorry, Stacey, we're having that little sound issue again, but I think it was okay at the end. Was the question how much protection was required by investors?
Yeah, how much of the key protection features were actually driven by the investors?
I think that from our view, the protection of the principal, and as I say, in our one, we were protecting 50% of the downside. The Benevolent Society had 2 tranches. One, 25% was the sort of equity portion, completely at risk. 75% was 100% principal protected. And with the Recidivism bond, which is yet to be launched, that would have been approximately 50% protected. I think the Australian market and the people that have been investing in this today, we have thought that we would have really struggled if we didn't have that degree of protection. I mean, in Australia, you can donate to a charity that might do this sort of work, and you'll get a tax deduction. And if you were at what they call a top marginal rate taxpayer, which is approximately 50%, you would get 50 cents back straight away from the taxman. So we've thought that while we're building confidence in this market, we should give the investors some degree of downside protection, approximately 50, because if they think it's really risky and they could lose all their money, they're better off just giving the money to the charity or the service provider and getting 50 cents back from the tax office. So that was some of the thinking. We would like, over time, as we build the market, get more confidence in the service delivery to really reduce that sort of capital protection, because it has a drag on the economics.
Mm. Okay, the next question is a bit complicated. It comes, I think, in two parts. The return of payment is determined by 55 to 65% of the children returned to the parents. I think this is about your new pin one, right?
Yep.
So who is involved in determining this range, and how aggressive or conservative is this considered to be? The second part of the question asks if there are any clauses to tweak this benchmark post-bond issuance. You'd like me to repeat that?
So, yeah, just the second half.
Are there any
there
clauses to tweak this benchmark post-bond issuance?
Okay. Can we tweak it later?
Yeah.
Yeah. So leading up to the implementation of the new PIN out-of-home care bond, the rate that children coming into the programs over the prior 18 months was, there was track record that demonstrated that 65% was eminently and achievable. So we had some degree of confidence in that. What's probably was a little less certain was how many people were going to come through the program and what would be the absolute number of children returned to their parents. We knew that once they came into the program there was a high degree of likelihood they would be restored. So we insulated the investors from the risk of how many children would be restored with their parents and just worked off for the investors, which is unlike the service delivery people, United Care, who are paid on the absolute number of restorations. Because we felt that was difficult, we didn't know whether the referrals would continue and whether they would expand successfully or there would be issues with expansion. We looked at restoration as a rate, and we feel confident and that will be the case. We've been going for 9 months now. We were launched in the middle of last year, and the rate's hovering around 60%. So we're confident about that. If, in terms of tweaking it, if the rate plummeted and it looked like things were going poorly, at year 3, if that's the first opportunity we'd get. If the rate has fallen to below 45% at that point, then we can end the program. We could also say, all right, well, let's try and continue at a lower rate. I think we've really, we've struck a deal with the investors. I'd be reluctant to change that arrangement. So it would be more about, we put to the investors, they've been performing below the trigger rate. Do you want to continue? For the following reasons, they think they're going to improve. So that's probably more the conversation that we would have if things went badly by the time year 3 comes around.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Just to follow on that, another technical question with regards to assessing delivery capability. Given that this will create additional administrative requirement to the NGO, does the government provide any resources or manpower to bulk up this capacity?
Yeah, that's a good question. And in New South Wales, it didn't. They went and called for a tender, and they selected really the 3 biggest service delivery NGOs, United Care, Benevolent Society, Mission Australia, all turnover, well, certainly Mission and United Care turnover, hundreds of millions a year. Other states have acknowledged that that's a bit of an issue, and we're hopeful that before they go to tender for social impact bonds, we've been in conversation with them about maybe they might, for 6 months or so, run capacity building with NGOs, and people like ourselves and potentially professional accounting firms and so on would work with organisations, look at their service delivery models, look at the target populations they're looking to address, help them maybe build a financial model, see if there is a compelling case, and give them much more capability. But yes, the government would need to pay for that. So yeah, look, I think it's certainly something that needs to happen. It's very difficult for a lot of small NGOs to get into this space.
Mm-hmm. All right. The next question refers to tax issues. Are there any regulatory or legislative issues that SBBs have run into in the various jurisdictions? And if so, how have they moved along?
Yeah, I mean, the structures to date in Australia have been, very much, they're tax indifferent. They're debt instruments that have funded social programs. There's no tax advantage to investors. They're not like the much heralded tax advantages for UK investors in social impact bonds. In Australia, it's just like investing in any debt instrument. There's no write-offs or accelerated depreciation that would generate additional benefits for anyone in the structure. We try and keep, from a tax perspective, everything completely neutral. And the only thing is, the Australian VAT, which is called GST, there's a bit of management around timing of that, but otherwise tax is not a big issue in these transactions.
Okay. So moving beyond Australia, we have a question asking, what are the main challenges in developing more social impact bonds, and also beyond Australia and globally? What do you foresee?
So, sorry, Stacey, that's what are the challenges in developing more social impact bonds in Australia?
And also beyond. But I'm not sure whether the question is asking if Social Ventures Australia were to develop this social impact bonds globally, or if other countries were to develop the impact bonds themselves. Yeah.
Look, we have. Yeah, I mean.
Is there any intention for SBA to do that?
Well, look, it could well be something that we'd like to do. To date, we've been a domestic organisation. The New Zealand government invited us over to help them develop their model, and they have just launched their social impact bond program, which is in the area they're focusing on health, particularly diabetes, I believe. And if you go on the New Zealand government website, you'll see that. So we have helped other countries. Some of my colleagues have presented in Hong Kong. We're open to helping governments and other our Asian neighbours, certainly with developing this market. It's just to date we kind of don't have the funding to go and help and discuss issues of social impact bonds. But it's certainly something that we would consider.
Okay. What do you foresee are the main challenges for the other countries to kickstart this or to implement this? And what do you think?
Stacey, we're having a digital voice issue again.
Can you hear me better now? No.
Let me just move. Try that. Yeah, that sounds better.
Yeah. Okay. I was just asking, what do you foresee are the main problems or challenges, obstacles for these other Asian countries to kickstart or to implement the social impact bonds?
Yeah, I heard that clearly. Thank you. Well, I think, not knowing, it's been a while since I've kind of spent a lot of time in Asia, but the challenges that arise with these things is being able to produce a clearly measurable savings for government. So being able to go to government and convince them that the work that you're doing will save the money. That's always the challenge. They because they might often think that you're doing good work, and they historically may have been happy to pay you to do that. But when you, if you want to sort of structure a payment by outcomes and share, and where they're on the hook to pay you some of the savings, it's a case of everyone agreeing that you can demonstrate and measure those savings. But I think in Asia, of course, there is vast populations in many countries, quite a lot of poverty. I'm sure there is there's a lot of difficult social issues. So the government should be acutely interested in the prospect of NGOs trying to address some of these social issues. There's also great wealth, so I think from an investor perspective, it's probably not such a difficult issue. I think it's is the NGO sector strong enough and developed enough to be able to identify programs either that they're currently working on that they can expand, or they feel that they could open up or introduce to a country that will generate savings to government. And as you can see, the areas that have been most popular to date have been the most easily measurable ones. Reduction of repeat offending, that you can kind of measure quite clearly against other populations. Reduction of homelessness. Reduction of children in care. There's been an early learning example. There's some health outcomes as well that people are working on. So measurement's probably the greatest challenge, and getting governments to sort of believe and invest in these things, I think, is probably the second one.
Yeah, I believe so too. So our next question is with regards to development bonds. Actually, our webinar last week touched quite a lot about development bonds, and the question simply asks whether you have come across development bonds. So this comes from Chris Greenwood. If I was going to ask Chris if you have a specific question to development bonds that you have for Ian. Otherwise, Ian, is there anything you'd like to elaborate on your experience with development bonds?
Yeah, look, I've read a little bit about development bonds, and I guess the only difference is instead of the government paying out on success, you find a development agency to do that, and that could be the World Bank, could be the Gates Foundation. It could be anyone who has, well, probably got to have significant financial resources to do that. They also have to have an interest in the outcome. But that has been an interesting kind of development, particularly in places like Africa, where you look at social issues like reduce malaria, reduce HIV infection, and so on, where supranationals like the ILFC and World Bank and others, it's right up there on their list of things that they're trying to achieve. So if you can go and privately fund that, and they valued particular outcomes, like things like health or a certain measure of poverty and so on, that's equally as great as well. I guess it's just important that you can have the confidence that the person on the other end of those payment by success contracts has got the wherewithal to do it, because you wouldn't want to, of course, I mean, it's an investor risk once again, and I'm sure that the organisations that would look at paying out would only be of scale. But yeah, look, it's an exciting development, particularly in parts of Africa and Asia.
Okay. The next question asks that it seems that SIBs mainly focus on rehabilitation and health sector projects. Do you have any ideas on how countries can structure SIBs on education and how this will benefit the education sector?
Yeah, well, the one education one that I've seen, and I've talked with my education colleagues at SPA about how we might work on them, but the one that we've seen successfully implemented was in Utah in the US, where there was a program working with preschool children to improve their literacy and possibly numeracy. It's on the Goldman Sachs website. There's a fact sheet you can find. And by working with this disadvantaged population before they go to school, they performed significantly better, and there was a test that they did at the very first stages of primary school that allowed the intervention to be tested against either historical performances or a counterfactual, and the savings that the state recognised were the reduction in remedial teaching, and that came at a cost, and then things like the sort of looking longer term. Once again, it's back to savings in the longer term, and governments being interested in paying for those, but people who attending primary school in a much better and prepared way are going to, there's an immediate cost of the reduction of those remedial teachers, as I mentioned, but also they're going to perform better in the long run, get better jobs, be more productive, pay more tax if their job is higher paying, and maybe less of a burden on the welfare system. So that's been one interesting example of an early learning SIB.
Yeah. I think actually Jane covered that last week during our webinar then too. I think it's really complimentary if our participants will be able to watch both webinars to get a really wider understanding of social impact bonds in America and in Australia. So I think we might have time for one more question if there's anyone who still has a question coming in. If not, otherwise we have one question asking about why can't the governments liaise directly with the NGOs with regards to social impact bonds?
Well, I guess that's the nature of them. If you can, of course, have a payment by outcomes contract. The government can contract directly with an NGO and say, you go off and intervene with a population around a particular issue, do your work, and if you meet benchmarks, we'll pay out a certain amount of money. And that's payment on outcomes, payment by success is a basis of contracting that is happening all around the world with governments, varying stages of development. I guess the thing about the social impact bond is most NGOs don't want to take that sort of financial risk.
Yeah.
They want to be contracted for a significant period of time to do the work that they do. They might take some small overperformance payment or underperformance discount, but they don't have the financial resources, or even if they do, want to be prepared to take the risk that they're unsuccessful. So then you could, the idea is with the social impact bond is, well, let's pass that performance risk and cash flow, give the cash flow advantage to the service delivery provider, the NGO, so that you don't put them at risk of blowing themselves up financially by being unsuccessful. If you pass it on to the financiers, they have to come to a view about whether that the NGO can deliver. So it's really, in that sense, it's a way of protecting NGOs and sort of pushing the risk back to the investor community But yeah, there's no reason why a larger NGO with some, more significant financial resources couldn't just do a payment by outcomes contract directly with government or a development agency for that matter.
Okay, I think you answered the question with a lot of background information explaining on the whole rationale behind social impact bonds. Well, thank you so much, Ian, for your time today. Thank you for this very enlightening session. So just to round things off, we will post the webinar recording and Ian's presentation on our website by end of this week. Please look out for that. And before we end off, I would also like to highlight that our next webinar will be on the BOP Marketplace, which will feature Jack Sim of World Toilet Organization and BOP Hub, and that will happen on 24th April. Please register for it via our website. We also have limited tickets left for our annual conference on 14th and 15th of May, so please get your tickets ASAP. Thank you for attending the webinar, and we hope to see you in May. Thank you again, Ian. Thanks.
Thank you. Lovely to have the opportunity to talk to you guys.
That was lovely too. Thank you. Bye.